The harmattan breeze whispered through the wooden windows, carrying a faint chill into the quiet Ghanaian night. The house was unusually still, and Mama Akosua felt it in her bones. Something about the silence felt unnatural. Her husband, Kofi, was away at a company retreat, spending the night at a hotel for a strategy session. He had called earlier, reassuring her that he'd be back the next evening. "Just lock the doors and rest," he had said. She had done exactly that, checked the locks twice, even peered out into the yard to make sure everything was in place. But tonight, her instincts wouldn't let her rest. The children had already gone to bed. Kwame, only 12, had drifted off quickly, while Kwesi, 17, stayed up a little later before finally retiring to her room. Akosua sat in her bed, staring at the ceiling. The faint ticking of the living room clock filled the silence, each second dragging into the next. Something wasn't right, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Then it came, the sharp sound of shattering glass, loud and violent, cutting through the quiet like a scream. She froze. Her heart pounded in her chest as she strained her ears. There were voices, muffled at first, then louder. Men's voices. They were inside the house. Before she could think, her bedroom door burst open. 3 men stormed in, their faces hidden by masks, their presence heavy with menace. One of them carried a machete, its cold steel glinting in the dim light. Akosua gasped, instinctively backing away, but there was nowhere to run. "Don't make a sound," the leader growled, his voice low and threatening. "You scream, and I'll make sure you never scream again." Before Akosua could respond, her children appeared in the hallway. Kwame stood trembling, his small frame barely holding itself up. Kwesi clutched the doorway, her wide eyes filled with fear. "Take them," the leader ordered. One of the men grabbed Kwesi by the arm, making her cry out in terror. "Leave my children alone," Akosua begged, her voice breaking, but the robbers ignored her. They shoved the 3 of them into the small bathroom at the end of the hallway. The space was cramped, barely enough for them to stand together. The door slammed shut, and a padlock clicked on the outside, sealing them in. Akosua held her children close, her mind racing. The air in the bathroom felt suffocating, thick with the smell of fear. Kwame's small hands gripped her arm tightly. "Mama, what's happening?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's going to be okay," she said, forcing calm into her voice. She pulled him closer, her other arm around Kwesi, who was silently crying. Outside, the sound of drawers being yanked open and furniture crashing to the floor filled the house. The robbers were tearing the place apart, taking whatever they could find. Minutes felt like hours. Akosua's heart ached as Kwame whispered again, "What if they don't leave, Mama?" She kissed his forehead, holding back her tears. "They will," she said. "They'll leave." The ransacking went on and on, each crash and bang making them flinch. Finally, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Akosua pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear any sign of the robbers. Nothing. Gathering her courage, she began to scream. "Help! Somebody help us!" Her voice echoed through the walls, but there was no response. She screamed again, louder this time. After a few agonizing minutes, she heard footsteps outside. "Akosua, what's going on?" It was Mr. Daniels, their neighbor. "We've been robbed. They locked us in the bathroom," she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. Soon, more neighbors gathered outside. They tried calling Kofi, but the phone kept ringing without an answer. Determined to help, the neighbors began breaking down the front door, but the robbers had barricaded it from the inside. Meanwhile, in his hotel room, Kofi stirred slightly as his phone buzzed on the bedside table. He glanced at the screen, squinting at the unfamiliar number. With a groan, he silenced the call. "Not now," he muttered, rolling over and falling back asleep. By the time morning came, there were 37 missed calls on his phone. Back at the house, the neighbors were relentless. They hammered at the barricaded door until it finally gave way. The sight that greeted them was heartbreaking: drawers pulled from their frames, shattered glass littering the floor, the family's belongings tossed around like trash. They moved quickly to the bathroom, breaking the padlock and freeing the family. Akosua stumbled out, clutching her children. They were pale, shaking, but alive. "Thank you," she whispered to Mr. Daniels, her voice barely audible. The neighbors stayed, offering comfort and beginning to clean up the mess left behind. Someone made tea. Another started fixing the broken locks. The community came together, but the pain of what had happened hung heavy in the air. Kofi returned home later that evening, oblivious to the nightmare his family had endured. He stepped into the house, his face frozen in shock at the wreckage before him. "What happened here?" he asked, his voice breaking the tense silence. Akosua stood in the corner, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. The children clung to her sides. "We were robbed," she said, her tone cold and measured. "They locked us in the bathroom for hours." Kofi's face went pale. "What? Why didn't you call me?" "We did." Her voice was sharp now, each word cutting like a blade. "We called you. Mr. Daniels called you. The neighbors called you. 37 missed calls, Kofi." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through the missed calls. His guilt grew with every unknown number he saw. "I didn't recognize the numbers," he muttered. "I don't pick calls from numbers I don't know." The room fell silent. Akosua stared at him, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "Your family could have died, Kofi. All because you don't pick up calls from strangers." Kofi lowered his head, shame washing over him. He looked at his wife, his children, their faces still etched with fear. He had failed them in the worst way possible. "I'm sorry," he whispered, but the words felt empty. That night, as they huddled together in what remained of their home, Kofi made a silent vow. Never again. From that day on, every call would be answered, friend, neighbor, or stranger. He had learned the hard way that some calls are too important to miss.